All right, we're studying in 2 Samuel chapter 2, and by way of just a reminder of chapter 1, we looked at the life of this lady who has been barren up until a point. She asked for God to give her a child, and she tells God that if you'll give me a child, I will lend his life to you all the days of his life. I'll give him back to you. And so the Lord responds to her, and this is known as what we know as the birth of Samuel. So her husband, Elkanah, and her, they went down to worship at Shiloh every year. Shiloh is where the tabernacle of God was before David brought it to Jerusalem. So Shiloh is where they would go to worship, and it was a great journey, and they would go and do that every year. And so after the child was born, she told her husband, Elkanah, that she was going to wait until the child was weaned. And we talked about the difference in culture between they and us today. Our children are weaned from nursing usually somewhere around age 1, give or take, depending on the comfort of the mother and the needs of the child. But in their culture at that time, and maybe even around the world some today, the weaning doesn't take place until much later, perhaps 3 years old. In some indications, might not even be until around 4 years old. That's unusual to us. But for her, she would wean her child, and then at the next time, appointed time to go to Shiloh, they would go, and she would present her child to the high priest, whose name was Eli. And Eli was an okay man, but he had a problem in that he didn't raise his children right. And now his children are grown men, and they are very wicked. We're going to learn a lot more about them today. But she does exactly what she promised the Lord she would do. She gives her child to Eli to be raised there at the tabernacle and to wait upon the Lord all the days of his life. And so we have the beginning of the life of the man whose name is on this book, 1 Samuel. So in chapter 2, hey, that would help if I was in 1 Samuel. I'm looking at 2 Samuel, and that wasn't making a lick of sense. You're all in 1 Samuel just waiting for me to catch up. Yeah, I appreciate that vote of confidence, because I knew it started with a prayer, a song. So what I'd like to do is to take a look at Hannah's prayer, and we'll probably just go ahead and read through verse 10 and then come back and make commentary on it. So Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. For no one is holy like the Lord. For there is none beside you, nor is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, and those who stumble are girded with strength, and those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, and the hungry have ceased to hunger. Even the barren has borne 7, and she who has many children has become feeble. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low, and he lifts up, and he raises the poor from the dust, and lifts the beggar from the ash heap, to set them among princes, and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength no man shall prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces, and from heaven he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and exalt the horn of his anointed." All right. I don't know how poetic the ladies of our audience are. Any kind of writing and poetry and thought are probably not as strong now in our age of technological advancement. We've made all of these advancements, but in the same time, we just don't think and use our critical thinking skills as much as we used to. We don't need to. I mean, we can, after all, we can Google it, right? So instead of actually doing research and studying things through and using our critical thinking like they did in times of old, sometimes we've kind of bypassed that. But Hannah has made this prayer to God, and it's actually in a bit of a form of poetry as well. It didn't actually rhyme in the ancient Hebrew, so it's not the kind of poetry that you would look at and think that it would have a rhythm to it. But there are a number of things about it that kind of set it in motion. Imagine, if you would, mothers, and we've talked about this from our last class, the day finally comes when your child is weaned, and you told the Lord, I'll give him to you, I'll lend him to you all the days of his life if you'll just let me bear him, if you'll just let me have that son. And this is the day that that happens. And this is the prayerful song, if you would, that Hannah utters to the Lord on the day that she gives up her child. Now think about that, because to be separated from our children, I mean, even when they grow up and should be moving out of the house, we have, what do we describe it as, empty nest syndrome, right? We miss our children when they leave. It's a natural process sometimes, but in this case, this process is not natural at all. She has made a vow to the Lord, and now she's fulfilling that. And you and I would think about familial ties and a mother with her son, little son, and think, oh, what a terrible and dark day this is. Hannah didn't see it that way. Samuel was the answer to her barrenness. She had had no children. She was under great persecution, and she knows the Lord has released her from her barrenness. And so she offers up her child to go and to serve the Lord at Shiloh all the days of her life. And what we see here then is it is a prayer of thanksgiving and praise to begin with. So when you look at verse 1 and 2, Hannah prayed and she said, well, what did she say? My heart rejoices in the Lord. Contrast that, if you would, to chapter 1, verse 28, when she says, I have lent him to the Lord as long as he lives, to be lent to the Lord. So they worship the Lord there. I said contrast, that's not the right word. So in the day that he was being left, they're worshiping God. They're praising God, and during their worship to God, this is what she says. And the first thing is, my heart rejoices in the Lord. Now, can you rejoice when you're giving up a child to no longer live at your house anymore, a small child, 3, 4 years old? I would say, no, you can't really rejoice at that. Can you rejoice when any separation comes in life? Usually that's not times of rejoicing. Can you rejoice when any tragedy comes in your life? Well, not in the tragedy, but no matter what the occasion, you and I can always rejoice in the Lord. You see, that's what she rejoiced. She didn't rejoice in the day that she gave up her child. She rejoiced in the Lord on the day that she gave up her child. So try to think about the difference there. It's like Job. Job, when he realized that he had lost all of his children, all of his livelihood, all of his cattle, he'd just lost everything. His response to that is, the Lord, naked I came into the world, and naked I shall return. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And he rejoiced in the Lord. Not that he was glad of the suffering he was facing, but he could be glad in the Lord. And I think that that's a matter of something we call perspective. We need to always have perspective. We can go through difficult days, but that doesn't mean that we have to cease rejoicing in the Lord. The next thing that she says is, my horn is exalted to the Lord. What does that mean, my horn is exalted? Anybody want to take a guess at that, or if you know? strength. Strength would be the better or best definition. The horn is often used as a picture of strength. When you look at, and just a few of the passages like Psalm 75 and Psalm 92 verse 10, here the writers express strength in the horn. It's like the strong bull has its strength in the horn. You know, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but the way a bull is created by God, all of its muscle structure focuses on the neck. I mean, the whole body of that bull, every sinew in his nature just culminates into his neck to where it's so strong, so powerful, so that when he lifts his horn, you know it. You know it. You recognize that is a strength. And the horn is often used there as that strength. But the interesting thing about it also is she says, I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. Was a smile on Hannah's face hardly at any point in chapter 1? Think about chapter 1 verses 6 and 7 when she was in the presence of her enemy there. Chapter 1 verse 6, and her rival provoked her severely to make her miserable because the Lord had closed her womb. And so it was that year by year when she went up to the house of the Lord that she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. That's how she was prior to the Lord blessing her with Samuel. Now she says, oh, my enemy? Well, I just smile at my enemy. I just smile at my enemy. What do you make of that? Do you smile at your enemies? And if you do, what result are you expecting? To smile at your enemy is a passive provocation. Right? I'm not worried about you. I can smile at my enemy and as if to say, have a good day. I'm not worried about you. I'm not concerned about you. That is a very different disposition than being under that yoke of her oppressor that just caused her to weep and not eat and all that. I mean, everything has changed from this blessing that she's come from the Lord. And so she smiles at her enemies. And then she makes this proclamation, there is no one holy like the Lord. And everything else she says in verse 2 is just a different way of saying that. There is no one holy like the Lord. We sing a song, don't we? There is none like him, none can compare. No God his equal, no prince his heir. Right? What are we saying? We're just saying there's just no one like our God. No one. So she's saying that here. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is, nor is there any rock like our God. The concept of a rock here is a bulwark. I can think of two rocks in this world that are just so impressive. One of them's right here in the great state of Texas, and that is when you go down to Enchanted Rock. If you have, has anybody ever been to Enchanted Rock? Oh, road trip, guys, come on, let's go. Nobody has been to Enchanted Rock? You've got to go. You've got to see it. Just go ahead and make your plans, but it is down in the hill country and it's going to get really hot, so that's an April-May kind of trip. You need to see it. It is what scientists believe the largest solid piece of granite on the entire planet, and it actually extends way under the earth and way south of what you see. But when you see this thing rise up, it is one solid piece of granite just sticking up out of the earth, and it's so solid there's no vegetation on it. I mean, you can climb all over that rock face. I went camping there with Bryce when he was really little, and Celinda's son Cody went, so the three of us went up, and I just couldn't get over how solid this thing was. You're not going to move Enchanted Rock. The other rock that I think of here on the earth is the Rock of Gibraltar, which sits at the edge or the opening of the Mediterranean Sea where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic. And even to this day of modern warfare where you've got airplanes and all of this kind of stuff, that rock still is a very strategic outpost, because if you own that, if you have that high ground, you can't be moved. And she says, there is no rock like our God. Jesus said in Matthew 16:16 to Peter, upon the rock, that is the confession that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God, I will build my church. So what do we sing? We sing, Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. We sing, there stands a rock on shores of time that rears to heaven its head sublime. How many other songs about the rock can we think about? We need, what that is, that's just stability, right? I mean, that's what that rock represents. There is no rock like our God. Hannah, thank you for sharing that with us as you pray on to God. Comments or thoughts through that? She makes a warning in verse 3. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. If you'll allow me to be just a little irreverent with this, she's talking smack is what she's doing. She's really putting on her game, but as she's talking this smack, she's actually saying no more of this. In other words, she didn't get ungodly with her words the way that her rival had done it. She was not unbearable there, but she says, hey, you want to keep talking, you proud people, you arrogant people, you haughty people, you want to keep talking? Well, talk no more, because there is a Lord of knowledge, and by him your actions are going to be weighed. God's looking at what you do. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no weight in what we say. There is some weight, there is some heaviness, some value in the words that we say. But that weight is there because of our actions. And here Hannah says, God's judging the actions. What do you do? And I think that there's a little bit to be noted of that today, because we got a lot of people in this world that say, oh, I'm a believer in Jesus. Or they'll say, oh, I have faith. Well, you can't question my faith. That's a matter of my heart. Well, I'm not necessarily questioning anyone's faith, but a lot of the book of Hebrews and practically all of the book of James is written to say your faith is demonstrated by what you do, not by what you say, by what you do. And so we need to recognize that even Hannah was talking about God back then as one who weighed by the actions, and how powerful and how true that is. In verses 4 through 8, Hannah praises the God who can change men's courses. And what I mean by that is she said, God's going to weigh your actions, but before you get to thinking that it's all about you, God can change your life in a moment. God can humble you in a moment. And I love the way that she begins. She said, the bows of the mighty men are broken. Imagine what it's like. I don't care what day and time of warfare that you want to talk about. So if it's in the day of a modern machine gun, or if it's in the days of slingshots, it doesn't matter. If that weapon, you're good at that weapon, but that weapon malfunctions, you're in big trouble on the battlefield. I mean, if you don't have another weapon that you can pick up, your whole destiny just changed because your weapon malfunctioned. Well, God can break the bows of mighty men. So you've got these men who they just look like they're so strong and nobody can do anything about it. Oh, God can do something about that. And he oftentimes has done something about it in history. And those who stumble, by way of contrast, are girded with strength. So just imagine if you're weak and you're stumbling and you're struggling along, you know what? God can change your destiny. God can cause you to be girded with strength. And then she says, those who were full have hired themselves out for bread. That's a change in destiny, right? She makes that attribution to God. And then she turns right around and says, those that are hungry aren't hungry anymore. Still, it's difficult for us to discuss hunger and even thirsting in our culture the way that it needs to be understood. To be desperately hungry, to be on the brink of starvation. We just use those words, and I'm just as guilty as anyone else. We use those words flippantly. I'm starving to death. No, I'm not. I'm a good 42 days away from that. I'm a good 42 days away from starving to death. But here, she's talking about it from that standpoint of those who understand hunger, who've been on the brink of starvation truly. They cease from hunger. They just don't have those hunger pains anymore. And she makes the attribution again to God. She continues on and says, even the barren has borne 7. The idea of 7 here being born to fullness, born to perfection. Now, she has reference to herself here to some degree, but she didn't have whatever 7 tuplets are. I don't even want to guess. What your Quinn is that? No, that's Quinn is 5, right? I don't know. Doesn't matter. She's not saying that she had 7 children here. She's got 1 child, Samuel, whom she's just giving up on this day to the Lord. But the Lord's going to bless her further. If my remembrance is right, after this she's going to have 3 more sons and 2 daughters. So she's going to be full. It wasn't quite 7, but she's using the word 7 here as a manifestation of completeness. The one who was barren, who felt so incomplete in her life, who felt like she was never going to be fulfilled because she couldn't go through motherhood, it's like she's born 7. She feels complete. Yes, thoughts? And then again, what does she turn it into? Those who have many children become as feeble. In other words, the Bible looks at children as being a strength. We look at it sometimes as, we look at people who, in modern age today, this generation, who have 6, 7, 8, 12, 13 kids, and we go, are you out of your mind? Are you crazy? Just a generation ago, big families were accepted and expected because you had a farm to run, and you weren't going to hire labor. You were going to bear children, and they were going to work together as a family. So our generation, it's kind of unique for us to have intentionally small families, 1, 2, or 3. Sometimes that's just to be a surprise. But the Bible always looks at many children as a good thing. The proverbist would talk about it as having arrows in your quiver. And here's a man who walks around, and it's like all of his sons are arrows in his quiver. And the more you've got, the more strength you've got. You're not going to run out of protection anytime soon. And so we should be accepting of that, and not as teasing of that as we do sometimes. She continues on in verse 6. I mean, the compare and contrast is very long here. The Lord kills, the Lord makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up. Isn't that interesting? To this point in time, has anyone seen any resurrection of the dead? No, there's been no resurrection of the dead here, but yet she talks about it in terms that if the Lord wants to kill, the Lord will kill. We get that. But if the Lord wants to make alive, the Lord can make alive. I think that even though it's not necessarily considered prophecy at this point, she will prophesy, but at this point, I don't know that this is considered by many scholars to be prophecy, but what does Hannah know that others don't know? She's talking about death and resurrection here. And if you think it's not the case on the first line, the Lord kills and makes alive, that second line kind of solidifies it. He brings down to the grave and brings up. I mean, she's talking about things that I wonder why the Sadducees weren't talking about Hannah's prayer, because there's an indication that they're brought up from the grave. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the beggar from the heaps to set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. Again, Think about what was Jesus when he was born. He was poor. As Brother Earnhardt said up in Mount Pleasant this week, didn't even have a midwife. No midwife there. Laid down in a feed trough in an animal shelter because that's the only thing they had. And yet he is the Prince of Peace. He is the heir of all things. He is the King of kings and Lord of lords. And look at what she says here. He raises the poor up from the dust and the beggar as from the ash heap to set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. Wow, what a powerful thing. She makes an establishment concerning the Lord. The pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. The concept here, we understand astronomy so much better than Hannah would have. Yet the whole idea that there is an order to the universe and that God is in control of it is very much on Hannah's mind. And so at the end of verse 8, that part that we just mentioned, the pillar of the earth and the Lord's, he has set the world upon them, all the way through verse 10, she begins to discuss how she is trusting in the Lord and she is trusting in his strength. Now, that's a good position for us to be in. We're told so many places, don't lean upon our own understanding, right? And to trust in the Lord always. And that's what Hannah is doing here. She put all of her trust in God, and he came through for her. And she really demonstrated her faith in an amazing way. And she gives all of that credit to God. God, verse 9, will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength no man shall prevail. Pardon me for going back to Brother Earnhardt twice. I might do it even more. But one of the things that Brother Earnhardt said this week that impressed me so much last week, he said, "You're going to fight against God? Are you going to set your hand against the one who gives you breath? You can't win. You can't win a battle against the God that gives you the breath of life." And here is what Hannah is saying. By strength, no man shall prevail. You're not going to get away with saying, well, I'll show God. No, you won't. That's going to come back on you. Sooner or later, when you begin to exalt yourself, and especially if you try to exalt yourself against God, sooner or later, there's going to be a day of reckoning for those actions. And so Hannah says, it's not going to be by our strength. We're not going to prevail by strength. Does the Christian prevail by his own strength today? No. Yeah. In fact, we have an adversary that is so much stronger than us that if it were not for God's strength, we can't win against the adversary. Fortunately, greater is he who is within us than he who is in the world. Otherwise, we would be doomed for sure. So she continues on. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. From heaven he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. That's still appropriate today. That day is coming. But now what I want you to notice, and this is where I was talking about the prophecy coming into play, he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. Exalt the horn. There's that strength again coming up in the horn. Exalt the horn of his anointed. What does that mean? She's talking about giving strength to his king. There's no king in Israel in the days of Samuel. There's not even a thought of a king in Israel. So what is Hannah talking about here? Well, it's true that Israel didn't have a king at this time, and at least at this time it doesn't seem like they want one, although the very next generation, or at the end of this generation, they will. So when Hannah is talking about God's king, she's looking ahead to Messiah. She had depth of understanding here that a lot of Israel had forgotten. She's looking at Messiah, the one who's going to right all of the wrongs, and he is his anointed. Now, what's really neat about this is, and if you take notes in your margins, you might want to write this down. This is the very first place in the scripture where Jesus is referred to as the anointed. And that word anointed also is the same word that gets translated Messiah. So she applies this epithet to him. Messiah is the Hebrew word. Christ is the Greek word. And anointed is the English word. So anytime you think of Messiah or Christ or the anointed, those are all referring to the same thing. And that's going to be adopted later on by David and Nathan and Ethan and Isaiah and Daniel. All of those succeeding prophets of the Old Testament are going to pick up behind Hannah and start referencing the Messiah as the anointed one. So she's trusting in the Lord here, and she begins then to prophesy. Do you remember that Zechariah, who was the father of John, who went baptizing in the wilderness, in Luke chapter 1, verses 69, he said, he called Jesus the horn of salvation. And what did he do? He quoted from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10. Then Mary, the mother of Jesus, would quote Hannah's song in Luke chapter 1, verse 46 through 55. What am I trying to get at here? Hannah's faith is incredibly important and relevant. We may not talk about Hannah enough, because she really has some insight in a day and time when, the book of Judges ended with, there was no king in Israel and every man did what was right in his sight. But here's Hannah, a woman who's just demonstrating faith beyond her generation. Other people in her generation didn't seem to understand what Hannah is understanding, and it's just such a refreshing hope to see anybody. And again, this is just another way for me to emphasize, and I repeat this pretty often because I've heard it too much in my life. I've heard women of faith in my life who say, well, I can't do this, I can't do that. And they start listing off all the things that they feel like they can't do. I'll tell you something you can do. Be a Hannah. Demonstrate her faith. Hannah was apparently, if not the guiding influence, a very strong guiding influence in her family. Elkanah had faith. It was Elkanah that says, we're going to worship, right? We're going to worship. We're not going to quit that. We're going to keep going to worship. But if you really want to know where the depth of knowledge appears to lie, Hannah gets the lion's share of that here. And that's going to be an encouragement to her husband, to her family. Somehow in those few years that she had with young Samuel, she must have instilled this in him for the life that he was going to live. And oh how it stuck with him. So we get to the end of her prayer, and in verse 11, then Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the child ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. When it says that Elkanah went home to his home in Ramah, that means the whole family left. There came that day. They walked away from Samuel. And I can't emphasize enough. Sometimes we fail to allow the emotions in the Bible that are really there. You tell me how you do that. You tell me how you pray this prayer. You tell me how you walk away from that child knowing that you're going to see him again in about a year. Your child's not going to be raised in your home. It's a very difficult thing, and yet Hannah demonstrates this so wonderfully. The other thing it says is the child ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. The child ministered. Where's my soapbox? I've got to stand on it for a minute. We don't give children enough credit. We don't give children enough responsibility. We don't give children the duty that they should have. We've got it in our mind in this culture that being a child has just got to all focus on the fun and the frivolity, and let's get them the best video games, and let's get them the best entertainment, let's get them the best toys, let's make sure they get to play every sport that they want to play, and we will wear ourselves out as a society just making sure the child is happy. Now, I'm not against happy children, but what I am suggesting is children were really happy before all of this modern stuff came along. I assure you of that. I are one. You know, I was a happy kid. I think about that meme that was out a few years ago. I hadn't seen it around. I'm going to have to dig it up and post it because I like it so much. It's the old black dog, and the black dog's kind of got a gray whiskered mask now, and he's got a little Irish cap on, and he says, when I was a child, I only had one toy, and it was a stick. And I'm thinking that was me. You know, what did we do? We went out and found, if we wanted to play guns, we went out and found sticks in the wood that looked just like the one we wanted the most, you know, and we would make that work. And I know that we live in a different culture today where the children don't get to roam like our children did. I get that. That world in some ways is gone. But how about instilling in children the need to serve God at an early age? Because here's a 3 or 4 year old boy who is now going to be standing before the Lord and ministering. And when you see through the rest of the book the powerful life that he lived, I don't think Samuel sat back one day reminiscing, saying, I sure missed out on my childhood. Well, I didn't get to do what the other kids do. No, he got to serve the Lord, and it was an impactful thing for him and for the whole nation. Thoughts? Comments? Okay, well, we've only got about 5 minutes left in class, but I would like to just go ahead and introduce the second part of 1 Samuel chapter 2, and that has to do with those wicked sons that we were referring to. So let's talk about Eli's wicked sons, and we'll pick up in verse 12, and I think we'll just read through verse 17. That's more than we can cover for now. Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servants would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was boiling. And then he would thrust into the pan or the kettle or the cauldron or the pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all of the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servants would come and say to the man who sacrificed, Give meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw. And if this man said to him, Well, they should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as you desire, he would answer him, No, but you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force. Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. Okay, we won't delve into that in its entirety today, but what I would like for us to understand is, especially when we begin to look at verse 12, and that is that there was great corruption among these two young men. They were the sons of Eli, and Eli was the high priest. They were priests. Now get this in your mind. They were the religious leaders of a nation, and the scripture explicitly says they did not know the Lord. Think about that. Let that sink in. They were the religious leaders of the nation, and they didn't know the Lord. How does that happen? Too many video games. Too much of something, and not enough of the other. And there is a sense in which that's a pretty good analogy, because the fact of the matter is too much of self-will, not enough discipline. And Eli is going to pay for that lack of disciplining. These boys are now young men. They're beyond the days of being disciplined, but because they didn't have it when they were young, they grew up very corrupt. And these are the leaders. Now, what happens when the leadership of God's people is corrupt? People are lost. It's no game, is it, Don? It's no game. We have to have a leadership that knows God. A leadership that knows God can actually lead. That is to say, they can focus on direction. They can push forward. They can guide gently. They can do all of the things that the shepherds later would be described as doing for God's people. Without knowing God, they will make earthly decisions in worldly ways of thinking every time. And when a congregation of God's people is led by men who know more about business than they knew about the Bible, you got a real problem on your hands, because the business decisions of the world and the worldly way of thinking, I mean, it comes and goes and it varies. The Lord does not change. And his leadership should know him. But they are corrupt here, and they do not know the Lord. And we're going to look, beginning next week, Lord willing, at the depth of their corruption. There are at least two major sins. One we've just read about, one we'll read about next week, that just cause them to be abhorred. But one thing is for sure, through the reading that we did do, here God has commanded all of Israel to come and to worship him at the tabernacle in Shiloh. And the tabernacle in Shiloh is being run by wicked men. And the result of that is what should have been a joy, going to worship God. The conclusion that comes of this is men abhorred that. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to go. Why? Because it's clear that the church isn't right. Speaking from the days of 1 Samuel, but you can see how when the church is not as it ought to be today, how the same kind of thinking ensues. So it's very important that God's leaders actually know the Lord, because Samuel's sons didn't.